The Spin-off Podcast Network.
You told the police that you'd never met my son, but you had.
Yes.
Now streaming on Apple TV Plus from Academy Award winner Alfonso Cuarón. Disclaimer.
It was time to bring justice.
Critics are raving. It's a cunning psychological thriller.
Something happened years ago.
What exactly happened?
He died.
Addictive and extraordinary. It's the best TV show of the year.
I had to tell the world the truth.
Disclaimer. Now streaming on Apple TV Plus.
Kia ora, I'm Amber Easby, CEO of The Spin-off. Just over 2% of our audience support us financially. For The Spin-off to deliver the work you love and value, we need to double that. Please visit thespinoff.co.nz/SOS to read the open letter about our future and sign up to be a member today.
Nau mai, hoki mai, kia ora fold, e mihi ne, ko Duncan Greive, tōku ingoa, and welcome back, Glen Kyne.
Kia ora, Duncan. Really good to be back. I feel like I've missed a big part of my weekly routine for the last few weeks, but really happy to be here.
Yeah, I'm so glad to have you back in time for what will be our final Fold episode of the year. And what we're going to do today is basically analyse the big stories of the year across the sort of the big news media companies in New Zealand, and then a few kind of recent beats that we haven't had a chance to touch on before we throw ahead to a couple of predictions for next year and maybe find, if possible, a reason to be cheerful out of what is inevitably going to be not a particularly, it's been a rough year. Like there's no sugarcoating that.
It's good to see. What did they say? Thrive to 25? Survive
to 25, very much. And look, honestly, it has felt like that, and not everyone has. And that's really probably a good place to start. So the biggest story of the year is one that you're intimately familiar with, which is the sort of the end of Newshub, and really a quite radical change alongside that in how WBD operates as a company here. Do you want to sort of, there's no one really better qualified to discuss this, just maybe start by kind of, telling us how that came about and what you think was the fundamental driver of it.
Yeah, well, I don't think we've spoken too much in length about this prior, but, leading into what everyone saw in the announcement in February was a lot of work prior to that around, could we reinvent the newsroom? Was there ways to do it differently? And, there were a lot of plans on the table that were looked at, and plans that looked really good, frankly. And I would say in a stable media environment, would have worked and would have taken Newshub, into the future. The reality, there were two things, though, that were playing against any what I would call iteration of the newsroom versus what was eventually announced. The first being that every time we looked at a plan for the future, literally 4 to 6 weeks later, we'd seen the market drop another 10, 15, 20% in terms of the advertising market. And when that is happening and you can't see where the bottom is, it becomes very difficult to kind of land on a solid footing, solid ground, if you like. So
let's talk about that because, I study the ratings reasonably closely.
Yep.
Nielsen sends out a top 20 for 25 to 54 and 5+ every week, and they come like 10 days delayed, but that's about as good as it gets in terms, unless you're like in the business with an expensive Nielsen sub. And there has been audience decline, and that has been going for years. And this year has at times felt steeper than most in terms of particularly the bottom end. The sort of top end of shows have largely held up more or less, but in that sort of 10 to 20 range, you're sometimes seeing, in 25 to 54 shows with, which are making the top 20 with less than 50,000 viewers quite regularly. Even saying that, it did feel like the kind of scale of financial the dropping away that you're just describing was outpacing audience decline. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, 100%. So there are two things. There's what you're outlaying, which is the structural decline of linear broadcast television, which has been happening for years, arguably accelerating a little bit based on streaming growth and new streaming platforms coming to market. And so you have this double whammy, right? You're in the structural secular decline that you have to deal with, and there are ways of dealing that. But when that is then, on top of that, you're dealing with complete, and really unprecedented, I hate saying that word, but it was unprecedented drops in advertising revenue. So the total amount of money sitting there for broadcast television just dropped so much in the past 18 months. Those two things effectively, and I should say actually, just to add on to that, as a global parent company, WBD, from the days of the merger with Warner's in mid-2022 or early 2022, between 50 and 60% of its share price falling away, largely because of that secular structural decline away from broadcast television, and therefore the revenues falling away out of it. And so when the company is looking at a market like New Zealand, those two things those three things really starting to impact to land at the decision we eventually landed at.
And so you had this. It was just shocking, the speed of events, and we'll talk about TVNZ in a second because they responded. Not necessarily responded, but certainly they had their own announcement within days of yours. But the thing that was potentially unexpected, though, quite quickly, the rumours were that you were looking to try and find a way of replacing 6 p.m.
Yeah.
And I think it was less than a month until, or maybe a little longer, but certainly weeks, not months, that Stuff had been announced as successfully bidding to kind of replace the 6 p.m. bulletin, what we now know as 3 News, and had to throw together a bulletin in just extraordinary time, especially given that a lot of the people they hired to do it were still working at WBD, working at Newshub until the June 30 shutdown. What was it about the sort of Stuff approach that kind of made you pick them? Because in a lot of ways, you looked at them from the outside and you go, they're a huge newsroom, the country's biggest, and got great geographical spread, but didn't have the same kind of broadcast capabilities as some other people who might have been bidding.
Yeah. So let me just draw you through the process a little bit. Leading into the announcement, when we announced the proposal to close Newshub in February, we had no plan necessarily at that point to outsource a news bulletin. We knew that on the back of that decision, there would be a lot of narrative in the market and that there was the potential for it to cause further change, i.e. things that we might see in the future at TVNZ, or create consolidation of some form. We knew that they were things that would, rear their heads. What we didn't anticipate was the scale of response post-announcement around the number of potential participants to create a news bulletin. So I immediately turned my attention from the announcement and dealing with that and working, as closely as we could with our staff to help manage through that, into effectively an evaluation process to look at the participants. And we had around about 15 to 16 participants from around the world that were looking at, could they do something? What it came down to was a couple of things. One, to make a credible news bulletin work, 7 days a week, albeit 30 minutes at the weekend, you have to have a strong pipeline of journalistic content coming through every day of a very high quality, and that means that you have to have exceptional news gathering capability. There were very few proposals that could address the news gathering capability element. The other thing was it had to still fit and feel like a 3 bulletin. And so a big part of that is what you've seen and what you've just alluded to was making sure that a lot of the personnel that Stuff effectively, eventually employed were retained to have that kind of look and feel as close to as possible what the audience was used to in a Newshub bulletin. And with Stuff in particular, What I would say is that, Sinead and her leadership team did an exceptional job of engaging with me, members of my team that were evaluating and really, really leaning in to the process, acknowledging things that they didn't know about broadcast and asking really good questions around how to I guess, close the gap around that knowledge. And that leaning in gave a really strong sense of confidence that stuff were in it for the long term, and we're going to give it a bloody good shot, as they have.
So, Emmy, we will get to stuff again later on because I want to talk about them. They've had, I'd sort of say, alongside WBD, had the biggest year in terms of change in the local market, in terms of the scale media players. But immediately after, it felt like TVNZ responded with some sort of shock and awe announcements of their own, in that Sunday and Fair Go led the way of a major round of redundancies there. Now, these were two sort of really core parts of their current affairs infrastructure, weekly shows that ran for most of the year, that had huge audiences. They were both regularly in the top 5 for ratings, and they were entirely commercially funded, even though they had strong public interest to them. And I think because those two things came in concert, it had this, you sort of suddenly realised just how vulnerable the whole ecosystem was. TVNZ, on some level, the WBD stuff was, 3 has always had a slight air of chaos to it.
Yep.
It's never had the kind of solidity of ownership or the same structural advantages that TVNZ has. So to see, this rock of our media suddenly making moves that you wouldn't make unless you're under extreme financial stress, with a very new CEO and Jodie O'Donnell in place, it was shocking, right? How did you sort of respond to that, and do you think that it was the sort of the right move, and how, and also how connected do you reckon it was to the fact that you'd made that move, which provided a bit of air cover in terms of signalling just how hard things were getting in ad-funded television?
Yeah, look, lots of thoughts and reflections on that time. One, the pressures in the system were no different from TVNZ as they were for WBD. The structural decline of linear audiences, trying to shift to digital, the loss of ad revenues, all those pressures are the same, and arguably potentially at a greater scale for someone like TVNZ. So those pressures were there. What was unusual was a couple of things. One, no more than 12, 18 months prior, you had the CEO of TVNZ at the time in front of a select committee saying, hey, our revenues are fine far into the future, as part of the proposed merger, when clearly they weren't. We were seeing the signals 18 months prior to, our announcement of what was going on. So that was at odds with some of the messaging that had been coming out of TVNZ prior.
Do you think that when they made that statement, were they willfully blind, or was TVNZ for some reason slightly more insulated than WBD from kind of, maybe it was just there was a delayed impact?
Look, I'll never be able to answer those questions. There's been lots of things that I found strange around TVNZ's, corporate behaviour, and this is with prior CEOs, I should mention. Only a couple of weeks before we announced the shutdown of Newshub, I approached, the chair and the CEO with an idea of, could we look at merging the newsrooms that could be good for both companies? And of course, that was written off almost immediately. And yet, a week after the Newshub announcement, you saw TVNZ making announcements to shut down its own programming. So those things also felt a bit incongruent with each other.
Yeah, that's interesting, right? Because there's sort of two ways to war game this if you're an opposing CEO. One is, we'll hurt, but they'll hurt more, and potentially will outlast them, and therefore have a larger share, maybe even the whole of a smaller market, and that might be better. And that's a horrible calculus in many respects, but you can understand how people might look at it that way. Another is just that it's almost like DNA level to not collaborate like this. Because you do imagine that if you had something like a an NZPA type structure for certain forms of news gathering, whether it's getting video of particular events, and then you competed more over a smaller field around politics and around kind of framing stories and so on. That, do you think that would have bought time for Newshub, or ultimately was it getting it up and running, and it was not going to be enough of a difference?
Well, the short answer is we'll never know because we never engaged beyond the initial conversation. But look, I believe that, the two companies had the talent in them to be able to innovate and find a way forward through that, and to look to potentially bring other partners in to provide a way forward that would have been good, not just for the companies, but for journalism as a whole in New Zealand. That didn't happen. We did then see, so I do think that TVNZ moved quickly after the Newshub announcement, seeing something of an umbrella to be able to make announcements. Those announcements to me felt a little knee-jerk in terms of the speed and the decisiveness with which was what was announced or proposed. Clearly there were issues there. That Michael Wood raised and have subsequently caused, further process for TVNZ. It was very evident to me, Duncan, that on the back of those announcements, there were a couple of things that were interesting, I guess. One, it never seemed to me that what they announced was enough economically to get them through, and clearly it wasn't, because they subsequently announced further. And the other thing is, I just found it strange choices in programming, given the vast array of programming choices they had, that they would go down, particularly Sunday. Broadcast television, despite the decline in revenues and audiences, is anchored around a Sunday evening. You win Sunday night, it sets you up for the week. Most of the promos for the programming during the week happen on a Sunday night during prime time. Most of the revenue for television, originates on a Sunday and sort of flows through to a Thursday night. Fridays and Saturdays are a bit quieter. So I just found that unusual. That they would go down that path, just as I say, given the vast array of other choices they had. Yeah,
it's interesting, right? And if you look at how some other events unfolded, you wonder if, with hindsight, there was a different approach that could have been taken. I'm thinking particularly of what happened with Shortland Street, right? So this is, another TVNZ product, another absolute kind of core piece. It functionally is the news in terms of what it does for TVNZ2. Now, that also, after being a commercial juggernaut for years and years and years, suddenly became borderline uneconomic. But a very persuasive, clearly lobbying campaign happened to the point where it reduced to 3 nights a week. But it was saved because New Zealand On Air was willing to, for the first time since its first year in market, start paying for it again. Not the whole production cost, but a contribution towards it. And that was a recognition that it performed so many amazing things for this country, in terms of, the way that it keeps directors, actors, writers in business, the way that it sort of upskills people.
Yep.
It's just this massive operation. So even at a slightly reduced capacity, it retains a lot of that. But it was quite shocking to think that both New Zealand On Air and TVNZ were willing to kind of work up to and forge a compromise when Shortland Street was considered, but not for Sunday or fair go. And, given the sums involved and the kind of work that not always, but can come out of Sunday, that seems like a real missed opportunity to at least test the appetite of the funder to maybe come to the party a bit with shows like that.
Yeah, I think a big part of the problem was the narrative that TVNZ was putting out a long time before that was there's nothing to see here, we're fine. And so there hadn't been an active conversation, I don't believe, with, either the Film Commission or New Zealand On Air or others. Probably, I'm sure there was with the production community, because they would have been signalling that, hey, we can't afford to, pay the current cost. But beyond that, I think the narrative probably worked against them, which meant that you then saw a very fast, quite knee-jerk process occur where it never felt like, and we never heard we've looked at our total content portfolio. We've decided to reduce our acquisitions budget by X. We decided to not do this, not do this. You never heard that holistic picture. Now, I've no doubt that they have done a lot of those things, by the way, but we never heard that up front.
I mean, that's in part some of the poisonous choices that impact media, where on the one hand, we have to tell a story to audiences and advertisers that, the year's never going to be better or more fun. That kind of classic, the craziest night on the block ever kind of thing that just seemed to happen every day on that show is a sort of cipher for what we're always trying to do in media, while at the same time being honest with other stakeholders, New Zealand On Air, the government, whoever else, that we sort of need help. Those things aren't particularly congruent as narratives.
No, they're not. But I just look at, the spin-off, Duncan, what you've achieved recently with your own announcement, and something that I firmly believe in is that you have to, for your people, for your staff, and for your stakeholders, whether that be government, advertisers, whoever it might be as part of your ecosystem, there's an expectation of authenticity, transparency and honesty around where you're at. And creating that environment then allows, I think, good things to happen, good conversations to flow and optionality to evolve. And so I firmly believe that I would much rather err on the side of that than trying to paint a good story for the next show coming out next Sunday night.
Yeah, that's true. And given that, well, there's a couple of things there. One is that you're actually right to point out that, even going back to Michael Anderson's time as CEO, 3 had a sort of corporate communications or a government relations ability to both be excited about its next slate of shows, but also say this is a structurally unfair market and it's impacting us commercially. So, maybe that's just a muscle that TVNZ hasn't had to exercise. I guess the other thing about our announcement versus, the kind of news that came out of WBD and TVNZ is that it really does show the extent to which pure advertising funding as a model is just incredibly hard. And if you're reliant on that, the ability of audiences, no matter how passionate or large, to come to the rescue the same way that they're certainly starting to see that with our appeal. And James at New Zealand Geographic has sort of, he's achieved his goal. You don't have that ability to do something with your passion. And I think we might be seeing the sort of end game of purely ad-funded media in a market the scale of New Zealand.
We are. And in fact, anyone that thinks there's a media business to be built on the back of advertising in New Zealand, I'd be strongly advising them against that. I think, we're going to get to predictions later, but, we're moving to a world of media models beyond advertising. It's not to say that advertising can't be a part of it, but there has to be other revenue streams. And if you just look at the New Zealand landscape, 2 of the companies that have performed the best this year, relative to others, Sky and NZME, highly diversified businesses with paywalls, multiple income streams, different commercial strategies, admittedly. NZME, very segment specific in terms of a lot of the advertising revenue, and particularly in real estate. Strong paywall operation and growing paywall operation. And Sky, highly diversified, right, in terms of where their incomes are coming from. So, I think the world is beyond advertising.
Yeah, absolutely. We'll get to having a bit of a closer look at Sky and NZME later on. Before that, the flow-on impact of these 2 sort of seismic shocks in the free-to-air sector. Now, we focused on news because there was these just absences, these things that used to be there, and then they weren't. But the production sector has been as impacted, albeit a bit more quietly, partly because the news industry loves talking about news, partly because the lack of a renewal of a show or a new show that doesn't get commissioned is invariably not as big of a story as the end of a long-running, always-on news service. But the production sector has been seismically impacted by those changes to the advertising market. And so, you've seen all kinds of shows which had been considered basically, they were fully commercially funded, things like the Great Kiwi Bake Off, and or the Block, these shows that were just always being made and suddenly just weren't there. And I think because of the delayed impact of that, next year is when that will really start to bite, because there were shows that were commissioned this year that just won't be again. I mean, Warner Brothers Discovery has said it won't be doing fully funded shows anymore at all. TVNZ will be vastly shrinking the amount of that it does. From your conversations with the commercial sector, how are they holding up?
Well, they're doing it tough. I mean, most of the big production companies in New Zealand have been through their own, rounds of job layoffs. Warner Brothers, ITVP, have laid off roles, SPP, I could go through every company. There's been a layer of or enormous disruption, I would say, as a result of decline in broadcasting to the production sector. And I firmly believe that the production sector is as important as our journalism sector in terms of reflecting New Zealand back to ourselves and exporting brand New Zealand overseas. Really, really important sector. I think part of the struggle is, again, the if you like, the infrastructure and the kind of regulatory environment we operate under is not necessarily helpful to them at the moment either. It's a little confused and a little opaque and difficult for them to get the kind of maximum amount of value out of their sector that they can. So work to be done in that, which we can come back to. But I think what you are seeing amongst those production companies right now is a lot of innovation of how they can continue to employ people, create content, and find new sources of distribution for that content, be that overseas, be that on streaming platforms, be that on YouTube, be that wherever. You're seeing a lot of effort go into that right now. I do think on the broadcast piece, it is somewhat cyclical. And what I mean by that is, if you go back, 10, 12 years, most of what you were watching on broadcast television at that time was internationally acquired content from either the UK or the US. And it was about 2013, 2014, where 3 was actually the real driver of bringing, local reality series and local television onto the screens. We're in an economic cycle where that's not viable right now for both companies, as we've seen for both TVNZ and WBD. And not to say that they're not doing it, because they are still doing a lot of local content, but it's funded. But I do think you will see that come back over time, because as they move to an increasingly streaming-led proposition, again, you're gonna hit this point where we kind of hit the ceiling around. There is a lot of content across a lot of streaming platforms. What is going to differentiate us? And I think local content will come back into the mix. TVNZ are probably a better place for that right now, because they've got a sporting portfolio of local and just have a stronger local content slate going right now. But I do think you will see that come back. The scale to which it comes back, I'm not sure. And in a paid streaming world where you're diversifying outside of just advertising and you put a paywall up, I would suggest that international content will perform better in that environment for a while, until the quality of production can be such that people are prepared to pay for it.
So just before we move on, I kind of want to acknowledge that while Newshub, was the biggest story, and those TVNZ layoffs and kind of cancellations were kind of close behind, it was actually a year where we just saw vast amounts of news infrastructure disappear from broadcast television. So, just before the end of last year, I remember seeing you speak very, very well and emotionally at the end of the project. Obviously, Sunday and Fair Go, we've mentioned. There were, the midday bulletins of both Newshub and TVNZ, and TVNZ's late bulletin, all gone. And just lately, Te Ao News on Whakaata Māori announced as ending, I think just Friday just gone. And the NZ Herald's Focus Bulletin, which had been running for 8 years. So if you think about the raw amount of regular news and current affairs video product that was being made this time last year versus what we'll start at at the beginning of next year, it's just a stunning volume. And, not that those things were all necessarily highly rated, but they meant that the ambient news environment, the kind of thing that you would be grazingly exposed to in various locations, it's just completely different. And we'll talk again about how that's impacting other parts of the news infrastructure later on, because there've been newspaper closures as well. And there's one I want to talk about in particular because it feels emblematic. But it's a scary time for us if you believe, as I do and I know you do, that having a certain volume of journalism and having it be reasonably accessible is important for your democracy, for your culture, for your for your business sector, for all kinds of different parts of your country, and that we are seeing hundreds upon hundreds of journalistic jobs and seemingly dozens of journalistic products just disappearing from the market with nothing particularly replacing them.
Yeah, we've never seen a year that's sort of destroyed value as much as we have in 2024, that's for sure. My question always is, what's the alternative? I don't think I've ever heard a coherent argument from anyone around a credible alternative to, what is local news journalism. You hear these ridiculous comments that people are going to get their news via social media. Well, define news. This is just ridiculous talk.
Yeah.
Ill-informed, and, a downward spiral for a democracy at its end game. So, what's the alternative? We have to, and it's hard because, media talk about media and people get sick of media talking about media, and I do understand that and empathise for that. But how do we get people to care about what we're seeing as, long-term destruction in, journalism in New Zealand? And how do we have a debate with that where we actively, with government and industry, shore that up?
Yeah, I too, as someone who's beat his media and who, until recently ran a media company, I get that there is a level of fatigue at the news about the news thing, but it is. I guess that the thing that always strikes me is that it would feel more like an emergency in another country, and I think just across the ditch in the Tasman, and maybe this is time to sort of touch on this before we move into some of the other companies, is that the sort of mismatch in sort of regulatory regime and in terms of what they fundamentally provide to a population between the large technology platforms and local news organisations and local broadcasters is considered an incredibly important sphere of both competition and through the ACCC, it's assessed under that lens, and then corresponding regulatory and legal response. And we just haven't been doing any work there. By comparison, there are constant, always on work streams across most vectors of the problem there. It is arguably the biggest kind of rolling story in Australian politics at the moment, is how to deal with digital giants, and the contrast with here is quite striking. The one positive that we sort of had, and this is literally in the last few days, is that the main piece of legislation that has existed, in various forms for a couple of years now is this Fair Digital News Bargaining Bill, which was descended from an Australian piece of legislation that got results in the early part, and so we thought we'll piggyback off that. That has been sort of haltingly lurching along for much of the year, even as it was becoming increasingly ineffective in Australia. And what you saw last week was Australia say, well, because Meta has effectively opted out of it, we're going to change our regime to kind of force them to join in, whether they like it or not. And on Friday last week, Shane Curry reported for the Herald that Paul Goldsmith has essentially said we're going to look very hard at that and likely amend our legislation so that it effectively matches it. That does feel like the first positive signal that we're going to see an alignment with Australia there. And if that becomes a kind of a broader based alignment, you might see, the fact that the Australian production sector has got a lot more work out of the likes of Netflix and Amazon. There's all kinds of ways that Australia has, through sort of, fair means or foul, it started to get responses out of big tech companies, and that's a sort of a rare bright spot, is that glimmer of hope that New Zealand might stop with this complete hands-off, laissez-faire attitude towards the technology companies.
Yeah, well, I thought the signal from the minister last week was positive. My personal views were that the proposed Fair Digital Bargaining Act was not going to work or make a meaningful difference into the future for journalism.
It might have had the reverse. I think the Google's threats were very real. They said they would drop distribution of news and end their deals if it were passed, and there were conflicting ideas about whether that they would do that or not. But certainly, it was not an uncredible threat. No,
that's right. There are things that I really, really like. Whether they are right or wrong, by the way, in terms of how they execute and the result is another question. But some things that I really like about what are happening in Australia that I really hope Minister Goldsmith and his advisors pick up is that they are not looking at just one part of the media ecosystem. Yes, they're going to look to, their equivalent of the Digital Bargaining Act to bring Meta to the table and others to the table, which is fantastic, and we hope to see that mirrored here in New Zealand. But, we recently saw a draft proposal to Cabinet that looked at a raft of measures to bring the platforms into effectively an equal playing field with media companies, treating them like media companies, including the introduction of, a minister, including the introduction of an Ofcom type oversight governance office to ensure they were acting, censorship. The decision last week or 2 weeks ago now on fining the platforms for scams happening on their platforms. We've got now some discussion happening in Australia looking at the advertising agency sector and potentially some regulation there around what's called principal media deals, and something we'll probably talk about more next year. But, it's well-rounded, Duncan. They are looking at every element of the media ecosystem and trying to create some modern reform. And whether they get it all right or not, for me, is a little irrelevant at the moment. The fact is they are doing things, they are trialling things, and they are entering into this world where historically to this point our government hasn't. And, I really, really, really do hope for 2025 we see some bold action for broad reform in the New Zealand media landscape.
Yeah, I totally agree. And there'll be people out there who think that this is on some level us, talking New Zealand media's book, or it's a kind of a protectionist impulse, but it's actually, and that's undeniably true on one level, but it's also just true that the difference in kind of regulatory restraint, legal oversight, competition oversight that exists between the two sectors is extraordinary, and it's a massive contributor to the different outcomes that we're seeing. And the idea that you can get your news from social media creates nothing in and of itself. It is a system of distribution for content. So if you want news, culture, anything else that goes there, it will either be funded or it won't exist. And that's really what it comes down to. So you can create a market-based system that naturally creates it, or you can leave it to a non-functioning market and just have it disappear and then just sort of see how things play out. And we have an option next year before it is too late. We are sometimes referred to as a cautionary tale in Australia. There is still an opportunity to rebuild out of that, but it will take swift, decisive action in 2025.
Yeah, and as an industry, we're not asking to be treated in a preferential way. We're asking to actually everyone to be treated equally. That's, the primary point here, and that platforms are treated as media companies and regulated accordingly. And also, even when it comes to the Fair Digital Bargaining Act, where you would say, there would be some critics out there that go, well, that's just money going into the media's pockets. Well, anywhere else, media's content that's originated by that brand and turns up on another platform, they get paid for it. That's how licensing of content works in the media world.
Absolutely.
And
right.
So we're just asking for exactly the same thing in a journalistic context. So we're not asking for special treatment. We're just asking to be treated the same.
You told the police that you'd never met my son, but you had.
Yes.
Now streaming on Apple TV Plus from Academy Award winner Alfonso Cuarón. Disclaimer.
It was time to bring justice.
Critics are raving. It's a cunning psychological thriller.
Something happened years ago.
What exactly happened?
He died.
Addictive and extraordinary. It's the best TV show of the year.
I had to tell the world the truth.
Disclaimer. Now streaming on Apple TV Plus.
Hi, I'm Anna Rafferty-Connell, Head of Audience and Senior Writer at The Spin-Off. Right now, only 2% of The Spin-Off's audience supports us financially. The future of The Spin-Off depends on doubling that number. Please visit thespinoff.co.nz/SOS to read an open letter about why we need your support today.
Kia ora, I'm Duncan Greive, founder of The Spin-Off. The threat facing media in this country is existential, and we need your help to make sure The Spin-Off survives. If you love what we do, visit thespinoff.co.nz/SOS to read our open letter about why we need your support, and please consider making a monthly contribution. So let's now move on to some of the other big media companies in New Zealand and just have a quick run through of their years in 2024. Let's start with Stuff. They probably had the most impactful 2024 in some ways. It started for them with a bang with the deal to create the 6 p.m. news for 3. And the way that was structured was, I thought, quite artful in terms of the way that they sort of looked at it, and that they got to keep the video content that they made for the 6 p.m. and run it on their platform. Essentially, the kind of bite-sized pieces could be accessed and monetized on Stuff platforms, while 3 got the opportunity to put it on linear and on 3 Now as a whole package. And that really is kind of neatly dividing the value involved in that. And I think I said at the time, and I still believe this, and that, you know, video is by far the most powerful advertising form on the internet, and Stuff was always a long way behind when it came to video. Most of its video inventory at the time was autoplay at the top of stories, which is you get views that way, but that's not really what a news consumer wants. Viewer. No, exactly. And most clients know that. So to have a large amount of high quality news content just sort of created was a massive thing. They also lost their CEO, Laura Maxwell, resigned not long after the launch of 3 News, and not long after that, Matt Headland, who had been heading up commercial for them. So 2 of their top 4 execs gone in a very short space of time. A massive change in the way that they created news, and the return of Sinead Boucher, who had been sort of acting as chair and publisher, into the interim CEO role, and she seems very much engaged on a day-to-day basis again. What did you make of Stuff's 2024?
Yeah, clearly a huge change of strategy going on internally, as they have pivoted, a lot more directly into video, and I understand why. Longer form video and engaged video commands higher CPMs in an advertising world.
Yeah, because it wasn't just the news; they also hired. Contracted Paddy Gower to make the fucking news.
Yep.
And had like the sail America's Cup, and there's just a really big amount of emphasis about that. And also we'll talk in a second about the sort of split of the company, which has been a slightly controversial story over the past week. But yeah, a lot of change, right?
A lot of change, and I think we covered this in one of the episodes earlier in the year. Laura leaving and Matt leaving is big. It's pretty significant. They are seasoned media executives, good reputations in the market, and have done a good job. And it talks to, I think, some of the difficulties of changing when you are pivoting in strategy inside an organisation. It's very difficult to turn the ship around, and you often see this, right, with leadership change come through. I'm pleased to see both, by the way, for both Matt and Laura. They've landed, fantastic roles. I think you're going to continue to see stuff pivot into the future, and I think that the split, was it last week when it was announced, the formal split of the company?
Well, it wasn't announced.
Well, so the internal email that suggested that there was a legal separation of two entities.
Yeah, I should sort of address that. So I broke the story, and I'm well aware that there is a difference of opinion, shall we say, in terms of the significance of it. I've heard from senior people at Stuff that the amount of emphasis that I placed on it in that story was overblown, and that Mastheads continues to be a place where the paywall digital journalism of the likes of the Post and the Press is housed, and that they consider that separation ongoing and crucial to be understood. What I tried to say in that story is that it opened up the option of whether it was taking investment into or outright selling one or both parts of the business, and if they wanted to, reorganizing it so one was really about creating digital journalism, and the other could be about continuing to sell, to basically to distribute journalism through print, but not necessarily to make it itself. I should be clear that I meant no disrespect by noting that. I personally think that would be a very clever strategy if you had the Stuff assets, not necessarily that there aren't other clever strategies to operate. But the challenge of running a legacy business with its own kind of costs and distribution elements, and a future-focused business that is purely digital, is enormously difficult. They have really different sort of revenue drivers. They have really different personnel needs, and one of them is declining, one of them is hopefully rising. You hope that they do that at the same time. It's just super hard. So there are different ways to approach it, but what they've done is open up the option of treating them in different ways. So that's kind of. To me, it made a lot of sense, albeit it obviously caused a lot of drama, which I genuinely didn't intend.
Yeah, well, I don't think there's. I haven't seen. I don't think an official statement from Stuff as to exactly why they did that. So it does leave a bit of room for speculation. And in my sort of experience and background, I applaud actually this decision because of what you've talked about, maximising optionality. If you're a buyer of a media company, and particularly of what would be deemed a legacy media company, and if you've got legacy assets, you're deemed a legacy media company, right? From a buyer's point of view, it can make it really difficult to be able to look at an asset and go, yeah, great, we can do this and do that. But as soon as you split the company and go, look, here's our digital future, and here's the legacy part of the organisation, it creates optionality for both businesses. The digital business is able to attract more investment into it for growth. The legacy business can be managed more for cash, and both of those can be attractive to buyers or for even as a seller or a merger. It just creates options for the organisation moving forward. And for that, I applaud Sinead and for doing those things. I think that, if they were a listed company right now, which they're not, I think they would have been applauded for doing so. And just as NZME did something similar, not too long ago, where they internally operationalised, their traditional legacy print business different from their digital business, went from a merged newsroom to splitting it back out again. I think these are moves that you've seen them play out around the world. You've seen Comcast do that now. David Zaslav, the CEO of Warner Brothers, announced just on Friday that they were splitting up the Warner Brothers legacy assets away from the studios and streaming assets. This is all done to create the maximum amount of options for either part of the business moving forward, which is a good thing. The difficult thing with these decisions is it can have a very damaging impact on people, because if you are in, and I suspect that's where some of your feedback came, Duncan, is that if you are deemed to be in the legacy business, there's a stigma that comes with that doesn't feel good. It's not true. It's made up. It doesn't mean you're not valuable, but those stigmas do exist, and you can end up having divisions in your culture as a result of those things. And I know that Sinead and the staff team will be eager to avoid that and make sure that it's it's business as usual for everyone.
So moving on to Stuff's kind of long-time rival in NZME, I sort of had a look before we came in at their share price at the start of the year. It was $1.06. Look at it today, and it's $1.07, which in a year which has been as disastrous for media as we've seen, and in a sort of triple dip recession or thereabouts. With a really, really tough economy, that seems, like kind of an unbelievable triumph in a lot of ways. What did you make of NZME's 2024?
Well, again, suffering from the same pressures that everyone else is, and you've seen that reflected, most recently in the close of some of the local mastheads, which was a real shame, but not unexpected, I don't think. I would celebrate $1.06 and maintaining that share price in a year that has had the turmoil that they've had. Michael's had to have a couple of profit downgrades, well, I think one at least this year. As a stock, NZME is probably more of an income stock than a growth stock, where shareholders expect a dividend more so than that, to see that continual growth in the share price. So Michael will be hopefully be able to tick the box on that as he announces the results next year. So I think all in all, a good year. But the real reason we were talking about earlier is the underlying diversity that they have in their business model, which paints a way over the future of how all media companies need to be thinking. I think the interesting thing for me with NZME is there's no proof points on this at the moment, Duncan, but in a paywall business, regardless of whether you are, Netflix, the Herald, whomever, the household can only endure so many subscriptions that they're paying for. And so you tend to hit a natural ceiling, particularly in a small market like New Zealand. And so I'm interested to see how NZME continue to evolve their paywall strategy, potentially into new editorial segments and different commercial segments to be able to continue to grow that, because I think they're going to need to, and particularly to build away from pure play advertising as well, to be able to build that more robust long-term business model. But certainly I think they've done an excellent job of weathering the storm. Yeah, I mean, they did shut down ZB Plus, which was one of their paywall products this year, but they continue to have Viva and this sort of collaboration with the listener on their content prominently featured, and Business Desk, obviously a very well-established success story there. So they're basically trying to rebuild what used to be a very diversified portfolio of newspaper assets into one of a bunch of different paywalled brands, which you can buy individually or as a bundle. One thing I just want to note before we move on is that Taupo, a city or a district of 40,000, started the year with 2 newspapers and ends it with none after the closure of the Times and I think it's the Taupo Turangi Herald. And it just, that's a lot of people, a really important town that, unless I'm missing something, won't have any journalists in it. And it kind of speaks to the, what lies behind these, when we see these closures, 13 community newspapers, and it sort of registers as this, thing which is both shocking but also inevitable. And then you sort of start to imagine it on the ground. And it's a big, that's a city that we kind of think about a lot, and it just doesn't have the sort of scrutiny that we're used to, and who knows how that is going to play out for it. Yeah, it's really concerning. I mean, both agricultural, tourism, hospitality hotspot, for New Zealand, with no local news reporting or reflection of what's going on in that community back to its constituents, other than what people might pick up in social media, and we know how that will, likely play out. So I'm actually interested to see what will happen down there, because I do wonder whether someone might step into the fold to be able to create a service, not necessarily specific for Topol, but people that are looking at areas like this where they think they can actually add journalistic value. And I'm hopeful that will happen.
And whether it's like buying, and I know that Michael Boggs has said there has been some interest in buying a few of those papers back into local ownership. Wish those people all the best, and we'll be watching closely. Another rival of NZME's, because obviously they've got the newspaper business, but they've also got the radio assets as MediaWorks. They recently received a bit of good luck, or in the form of this extraordinary saga of the biggest procurement in New Zealand media history, which is the AT Auckland Transport contract, which has been running this enormously lengthy, I think, 18-month procurement that has now been kicked down the road, I think, for another 18 months, so that oMedia and MediaWorks, the two kind of incumbents, both get to sort of keep that for a while. But also, that there is a sense that radio continues to, show these tiny incremental gains in audience according to its surveys. MediaWorks, as you well know, has always been had reluctant ownership, but at the same time, with all of the sort of chaos there's been at some of the other media companies, and not like they haven't had redundancies themselves, it feels like it's, relatively speaking, had a reasonable year. What's your sense of 2024?
Yeah, well, first of all, just to comment on the AT procurement contract, I just think it's really difficult and a little bit despicable, actually, that they should pull the rug out from that process. Not even at the 11th hour. I mean, they were due to announce.
It was 1 minute to midnight.
Yeah.
And they'd said as recently as mid-November that this wasn't going to, that they were on course, which seemed kind of mad at the time, but you have to take them at their word. And
honestly, and I just think, it's no secret the difficulties the media have been going through, out of home have been dealing better than most in terms of, the different players. But, millions and millions of dollars would have been spent. And the amount of time and energy and effort that could have been doing other things during this time hasn't. It's been allocated to, trying to secure these agreements with AT. And so really poor form, I think. I hope they tidy their act up and do a far better job. And I hope it's not 18 months. I hope it's a lot quicker than that for the certainty, because whatever the decision, there are implications off the back of that decision for all companies, depending on how it lands. But back to MediaWorks. Look, one of the things that on radio that, again, I think insulates them a little from broadcasters who are, reliant almost entirely on agency revenue and on major advertising revenue. And, MediaWorks, not to say that they're not, they still have a fair chunk of their revenues coming from that space, but they are highly distributed in terms of their sales operations throughout New Zealand. Most major towns, there is a sales rep forming very good and very close relationships, with the local business operators there. They are trusted advisors to those businesses. Those ads play on, key retail transaction times, to draw people into stores, and they do a very, very, very good job of that. And to this point, whilst, Google and Meta have still encroached into that space, and, a lot of those advertisers use those services, radio has stood strong and held its ground in that territory, and that's really held up the revenues, I think. And off the back of that, both NZME and MediaWorks have been able to, I guess, expand the portfolio of services that they're selling to those advertisers, which is, another way, I guess, of building some diversity into the business model. Right, it's created a more robust environment for them to operate in. So, well done.
Yeah, absolutely, and it does kind of. I remember a few years ago we met with it was the fine wine delivery company, and they sort of talked through that they were big spenders with Newstock ZB, and they would literally, like, they could play an ad, and then half an hour later they would see people just walking in the door, and it was just such a reliable medium. And I think that it's easy when you're in the sort of very digital end of the spectrum to kind of be a bit cynical about radio, and there are going to be challenges coming down the pipe, obviously, as cars increasingly, newer cars have CarPlay, and it makes it easier to switch to digital. But there's still a very strong audience, and it's baked in, that it has this, sort of hyper-local advertising function, as you say.
I think the interesting thing for radio, apart from the distribution, Duncan, which you touch on, is the cost and investment in the legacy AM, FM infrastructure. And I'm not sure when that comes up for renewal again with government. It must be coming up soon. But that's starting to feel a bit like Cordia does to the broadcast industry. It's starting to feel like a bit of a tax on the radio industry, and something that I've no doubt will be discussed and addressed, and we'll start hearing more about soon into the future.
One organisation that really doesn't have financial problems is RNZ, just to round out radio. It's quite interesting, right? They received I think it was $25 million funding boost under the last Labor government, which I think, interestingly, and probably to the government's credit, they left alone, despite the levels of clawback we've seen in a whole host of different departments since the coalition came to power a bit over a year ago. They have thus far spent a lot of that on building up the sort of volume and quality of their sort of text-based digital news offering. There's a lot of infrastructure upgrades that need to happen. There is a sort of a long-mooted app and digital kind of delivery of their audio and their products coming. But the most visible change is that they have hired a bunch of really fantastic journalists, quite a few from Stuff, and they've got Mark Stevens and John Hartwell, who are both ex-Stuff in senior positions there, and they've seen the rewards in that their digital news audience has gone from about 900,000 to 1.5 million in effectively the blink of an eye. So really impressive execution on that element of the strategy. They've handled the departure of Kim Hill from that Saturday morning slot, but largely the sort of RNZ national product is staying fairly still and suffering some, in the context of radio, some reasonable ratings decline. But RNZ is has gone from being not a backwater, but certainly not feeling like the heart of media. That was the hyper-competitive commercial world, to being a place that the commercial world increasingly looks at with envy. And, some very senior people look at and go, I'd quite like to work there, because it seems like it's a stable ship in a storm.
Yeah. Well, it's been the most stable. Well, it's been more than stable. It's been the growing part of the media ecosystem in the last 12 months. And credit to Paul and his team. Glen Kyne and others done an excellent job. Of growing the brand. It's interesting because Radio New Zealand, as a brand and as a name, probably doesn't represent what that entity is now today and into the future. It's so much more than just a radio platform. It is becoming a multimedia platform very quickly. I know that they're looking at their video strategy very closely. As well. So I expect it only to grow, and that growth will be, yes, to the chagrin of the media CEOs, because any dilution of their audience into RNZ means that that's money not transacting on their platforms, and that can really hurt. So how this balances out is going to be really interesting to watch over the next 12 months as RNZ continues to invest.
Yeah, there is a tension as it sort of improves the quality of its text-based news offering, it brings it increasingly into competition with the likes of the Herald and Stuff. And while they kind of maintain that that's a friendly competition and that there's a collaborative element through their content sharing, the more sort of senior journalists are picked off, or the more that they kind of find incremental audience gain and habit out of that, the more I think you'll see the commercial sector looking at them and potentially even talking to government about, what's really going on here. Like, is this public media that kind of fills a void, or is it stuff that is duplicating things that they're doing that are core to their business strategy too? And that just feels to me like something that will loom as a discussion point in the year to come.
There's no question, though, we need robust public media in this country, and I think strengthening of RNZ is a good thing. I think very important. How far it goes, I'm also interested to see, because I as I've mentioned before, I'm curious to see whether we will see again at some point in the future, maybe not next year, but potentially the year after, the TVNZ newsroom and that RNZ newsroom come back together.
Yeah, definitely. That is one sort of story that almost doesn't feel like it's qualifies as a prediction at this point. There's just a gravity going on there. Let's talk about Sky. So if we'll do the same exercise that we did with NZME, their shares started the year at 275, ends at 259. I wonder if some of that is just pricing in a little level of uncertainty around the New Zealand Rugby deal, which is up for renewal and still hasn't been announced, though you do hear rumours about it. But, their other big set of news was getting Max onto the Neon platform, which almost feels like it was a bit muted in terms of how loud a bang that was. But as far as the quality of the service and the continuity of that quality, seems like quite a big deal. I know that you study Sky quite closely and obviously had a lot of proximity to Max through your previous role. Yeah, what's your sense of their year?
Again, a good year. They're an income stock, much like we talked about NZME, so shareholders will no doubt be happy. Sophie's done a fantastic job of managing that cost base for a couple of years. What's been important this year is shoring up the content base and the content supply lines, which they've done a very, very good job of. Remains to be seen, obviously, what's going to happen with New Zealand Rugby. Rumours that there'll still be an announcement made this side of Christmas, I think. I saw something on that recently, but that is going to be, of course, pivotal. We all know why. Lots of speculation around what that deal looks like. I think the interesting thing for me for Sky is what's next. And so once, and I'm just assuming that there will be a good deal done with New Zealand Rugby, and on the back of that, one could reasonably consider that the content supply lines are reasonably secure for the next little while.
Yeah, it's interesting on New Zealand Rugby. I read Trevor McEwen's Business of Sport column over the weekend, who speculated that the sort of total cost of Sky might move from somewhere around 110 to 120 million a year to something more like 85. Now, they might have to forego some rights for that or at least share some rights, but if they're able to extract those kind of savings from their, what is still the core of their proposition to audiences, that will be a pretty extraordinary achievement. And they should probably, it kind of makes sense that they'd be able to do it in this kind of a market. And from there, what they do with that, whether they return that to shareholders or whether they use it to acquire some other properties that they can use to grow the base, it's a really, compared to the last time they negotiated this deal when they had to, literally give up some of their own shares to New Zealand Rugby in the process, it's just a completely different market. And, you've got to think that even though this one's dragging out the same way the AT deal has, it feels like it's very much in the buyer's favour in this one.
Yeah, I don't think there's a credible alternative at scale in New Zealand that can offer up those sums of money or will offer up those sums of money. So I think, Sky is certainly in a strong position, but equally, they will want to see investment still going into rugby to continue to see it thrive. So I think, hopefully we see a really, really positive outcome there. What I'm probably referring to is that, Sky have, like all pay TV operators in the linear business, have been suffering decline in audiences. Those channels, obviously, majority of them, they don't own. They buy from third parties, Comcast, Paramount, Warner Brothers Discovery. And if we're seeing this global split out of those cable TV channels into potentially a merged separate global entity, it'll be interesting to see how those channels invest in content and original content and try and keep eyeballs on the platform. And I think that is a big question for Sky's future strategy beyond, as I say, securing up these supply lines. I think that they will continue, and I think they need to continue to invest in streaming and on Neon, particularly now that they've done the deal with Max. We don't know how long that deal is for, but I think they will need to retain Max on the platform. They're going to need to continue to invest in Neon and have it as, top 2 type streaming platforms in New Zealand, which they've got the opportunity to do, very clearly.
Yeah, Neon feels like less of a content problem. It's, arguably even better than Netflix on that front, and more, it's just the technology trying to keep pace with Netflix and the like, which is obviously impossible, but is there a third-party solution that allows it to get some of the way there? Lastly, we'll talk a little bit about advertising, media agencies, that kind of thing. I mean, you could do a whole episode on that, but just last week brought news that Omnicom and IPG are planning to merge. There is a kind of an increasing divide between sort of these giant, increasingly even larger holding companies, which own a lot of kind of big creative and media agency brands down here, and a quite vibrant media sort of independent sector. So there's iMan started last year. That's the independent media agencies of New Zealand, and feels really vibrant, and like it's having a bunch of events and like it's got quite a buzz around it. Equally, the likes of Special and particularly Motion Sickness, hopefully Daylight, our sister agency too, I feel like they're kind of growing and quite vital in this environment and able to do that outside of the holdco environment. What's your kind of sense of how the kind of the agency world kind of played out in 2024?
This proposed merger certainly suggests pressure in the system. My speculation is that this, at the core of this, is about technology, actually. So the holding companies are increasingly moving into technology companies to gain kind of global scale at trading media. Consolidating companies allows you to reduce, find a lot of cost synergy in doing things like that. It also concentrates your buying power with the global platforms, and I think that's a big part of this, because on the other end of the spectrum, you're going to have things like AI, artificial intelligence, and tools popping out that democratise buying of media for small players, playing against the agencies and potentially taking money away from them. So I think that's at the core of it. One of the concerns is you're going to have a lot of concentration of power in a market like New Zealand. OMG, I don't know the latest numbers, but certainly when I was around, they used to represent more than 50% of media spending in New Zealand that went through agency groups. That obviously increases if this merger goes through. So wouldn't be surprised to see the Comcom take a look at that and go, does that concentration of power mean anything? The agencies are masters of creating kind of separation through different entities and effectively Chinese walls. Advertisers will get concerned that their competitors are potentially being increasingly represented by the same agency group, so that will be an issue. And the independent agencies will be very concerned about the concentration of power issue. And I think what is also a concern, and something we haven't talked too much about on this podcast yet, but we will no doubt get into in the new year, is does that concentration of power allow much larger principal media deals to be done in New Zealand, which then, over time just hurts the media publishers in New Zealand? Yeah,
it feels like the principal media situation was a sort of an underlying factor behind a lot of the issues we saw this year, in the sense, principal media means that a media agency buys, volume of inventory from publishers in advance, and then on sells that at a markup to its own clients. I think in a growing and functional market, that you can sort of make sense of that. But in a declining market like the one we saw, it becomes incredibly incumbent on those agencies to sell what they have before they sell anything else. And often where there are global deals done with tech companies and holding companies, it becomes the only job is to get rid of that inventory when everyone's trying to cut their budget. So certainly that's a new or emerging dynamic that seems to particularly impact the holding companies, and we'll see whether that pattern continues next year, because, as you say, the sort of incentives on behalf of the media agencies, the clients and the publishers change quite radically if that becomes an encroaching or larger part of the story. Well, and increasingly those, so many of the holding companies have set up individual companies now to do these principal media deals.
And increasingly, what could happen, I should say, is that as pressure comes on broadcast or digital publishing, local media companies, those principal media deals increasingly get done with Google and Meta, which further shifts money out of the local media ecosystem. And so, there's this kind of view of death by 1,000 cuts, right? And I think the concentration of power that they have around allocating where a dollar is spent in New Zealand, a subscale market, I think, needs some consideration.
Yeah, I agree. So finally, actually, before we go to predictions, I do want to sort of end on one positive note, and it's hard to pick a lot of reasons to be cheerful out of 2024, but I do want to credit James Frankham and a campaign that his sort of 2.5 strong team at NZGO, he went public in, I think it was October, saying, we currently have, I think it was a bit shy of 8,000 subscribers and really need 10,000 to operate as they do. And they revealed a bunch about their finances in the process of it. And just in the last 10 days or so, they announced that they've achieved that goal of getting to 10,000 subscribers. Obviously, we are currently in market with an open letter that talks about our challenges as a business. And, I would encourage any listeners who've enjoyed this podcast this year to, if you don't already contribute, to go and have a look at that if you can. I mean, ultimately, that speaks to the kind of just the sea change that we're seeing from a nearly entirely ad-funded media to one where there's going to be a lot more audience-funded media. And I think particularly in sort of smaller and more niche publications where they trade a bit on passion from the audience rather than just raw scale of audience. And, I think we've recently made public that we're a third of the way for our target, which is fantastic. Got a long way to go. So, yep. Just a brief plug for our open letter. But before we finish up, let's both go with a prediction for 2025. Do you want to start, Glenn?
Yeah, so my prediction for 2025 is at some stage, and I know this is a big window, but between January 1 and June 30, we will see an announcement for TVNZ launching a paywall on TVNZ Plus. And behind that, I think we'll sit 2 other announcements. One, a major content output type deal. It may not be an output deal in the historical contents, but some affiliation with a major US network to be able to bring content through that people are prepared to pay for. And secondly, a major sporting deal that also leverages that paywall. So that's my prediction, first half of 2025.
That's a good one. And yeah, I like that we've got this narrow window, first half of 2025. Mine is that we will see something in the kind of Newshub level realm happen in that first half of next year. I don't want to say what because it feels like it's inviting it, but I think what we'll see is something that is very large and important in our kind of news or entertainment infrastructure, which undergoes a profound change, whether that's a change of ownership, whether that's sort of shutting down. But I don't think we're done with major infrastructural shocks to our system. And you get the feeling that the survive to 25 thing, not everyone did, but there are some people who are holding out hope that there'll be relief in the first quarter of next year. I'm not at all confident that, notwithstanding the good signals out of Goldsmith recently, that relief will arrive in that quarter. And if it doesn't, I think something will have to give. So that's where I'm sitting.
Yeah, well, hopefully not. And I guess also on the hopeful front, let's hope. And not sure whether Minister Goldsmith listens to the fold or not. Duncan,
surely
he must do. But let's hope that we see some really well-considered, well-rounded, robust media reform that addresses, broad elements of our ecosystem, because all of those things are going to give positivity, I think, to content creators and others who are prepared to invest and sustain, operating in New Zealand, which is going to be really important.
That's more a hope than a prediction, but certainly I think we've got the glimmers of reasons to believe. Thank you all for listening this year. We've sort of had a format change. You've joined. I really appreciate our conversation and connection, Glenn, and Tahir Butler, always behind the desk. Also Isaiah Tua, who's taken in some shifts. It's been a year, and really appreciate everyone who's been involved in making the fold happen, either on the audience side or the production side along the way.
Thanks so much, Duncan. I've enjoyed the banter. It's been an absolute joy to join you. And look, here's to 2025.
Yeah, let's take a load off and get there.
Do you find it hard staying optimistic with all the financial news in the media? I'm Bernard Hickey, and on my podcast, When the Facts Change, I'm here to help you navigate the ever-changing landscape of economics in Aotearoa. So join the conversation every Friday on When the Facts Change, brought to you by the Spin-Off Podcast Network in partnership with KiwiBet.
Are you curious about how business can be better? I'm Simon Pound, and I host Business is Boring, a podcast where I kōrero with some of the most interesting people in entrepreneurship, commerce, and making things happen. Tune in to Business is Boring every Tuesday, brought to you by the Spin-Off Podcast Network in partnership with Spark Business Lab.
The Spin-Off Podcast Network.